Hello and welcome to Election Countdown, the first in a series of programmes in the lead up to the UK general election. And we're going to be looking at some of the key issues that the political parties are or maybe are not covering in this election campaign. And today it's banking. So Neil, why is it that banks have become a political issue?
Well, I think it's obviously a major issue in the UK given the amount of support that the government has had to provide to step in and save the banking system. But as a political issue, and between sort of the differences between the parties, I think you'll see over the next few months that there aren't very many differences at all. Effectively, the measures that have been taken in terms of policy decisions by the UK government and by the governments around the world, that has effectively sort of almost trapped the government and the potential next government into a particular policy line. And so there's very little sort of scope for the parties to have any sort of different policies on this issue.
So what do the parties propose to do then about the de facto nationalised banks?
They're probably their limited scope at the moment, again, given the fundamental weakness that they're showing. They still sort of require a massive funding gap, and that still is being addressed at the moment by the various lines of government support, etc. But there is this sort of inherent government, sort of this contradiction of policy that the government's had to impose on the banks at the moment. On the one hand, being seen to act tough and to force the banks to provide new loans to the economy, but on the other hand, effectively realising that in order to restore a healthy banking sector again, the banks from the position that they are now, very weak, they need to earn these big profits and as well to reduce their balance sheets in order to reach a more sustainable position. And so they're quite keen, without necessarily publicising it, for the banks to continue to earn these big profits. And also related to that is the fact that the taxpayers obviously has a stake in the banks now in terms of the shares it holds, and so the government wants the banks to return to a more sustainable position in order for the share prices to continue to rise. And so in time, when the government, or whichever government, comes to actually sell these shares back into the private sector market, it can say, look, we've made a profit on the policy measures that we took to try to save the banks, and so everyone's a winner as such.
Do you think that bank bonuses will be a live issue in this campaign?
It'll be an issue, I think, but in terms of the differences between the parties, again, there's very little. As I just said, the banks have to be seen to, well, have to make these profits in order to recover, and with big profits come naturally big bonuses. Now, the government might make a play of its sort of super tax, recent super tax 50% tax rate that it imposed on this fiscal year's bonus payments, which has brought in about £1.5 billion of revenue to the Treasury. But really it hasn't fundamentally changed anything in terms of the structure of bonuses being paid next year and year after. And so far there's been very little sort of movement from the other parties as well into how they might change this or in terms of policy going forward. So again, in terms of there's been very little differences between the three parties, it's unlikely, I think, to be a major policy issue during the campaign.
And are any of the main political parties looking to split the high street and investment arms of the banks, or is that now something of a dead duck?
At the moment it does seem a bit of a dead duck, given the sort of the reform momentum seems to have slowed both in the UK and abroad. There is a slight difference, I think, between the parties' approach to this issue. The government, Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown, have both sort of stated that they're not in favour of this simple split between investment and utility banking. The Conservatives are slightly siding a bit more with the Bank of England Governor Mervyn King, who thinks this is absolutely necessary as part of a whole range of sort of potential reform measures going forward. That it needs to address this issue of moral hazard that is residing within the banking sector, and will continue to sort of be a major sort of weighing down effect going forward in terms of major reforms.
So are we saying then that the city can breathe easily whatever the result of the general election?
I think probably they're breathing a lot easier now than they probably thought they would be after the crisis struck, and they were sort of so reliant at that point on massive support. I think the issue in terms of for the election, they probably can breathe easy. There won't be too many differences in the policies that the different parties are going to prepare. But I think over a longer term, they realise that there will be some changes in terms of higher capital requirements, higher liquidity requirements, a bit more tightening of oversight. And whether this is actually enough to address, again, this moral hazard issue in terms of the too big to fail. That is the key issue, I think, going forward, which none of the parties at present seem to be addressing.
Thank you, Neil. Well, I hope that's been informative. Next week we're going to be looking at regulation and how that's being addressed in the general election, and we'll also be inviting feedback from you, the viewers, in future programmes. Until then, please join us again next week. Thank you and goodbye.